Azure Landing Zones Explained for Midsize Companies. Welcome back. Today's topic is Azure Landing Zones Explained for Midsize Companies. We'll cover what you actually need to know about Azure Landing Zone implementation. Let's talk about what is an Azure Landing Zone. An Azure Landing Zone is a pre-configured, governed environment in Microsoft Azure that gives your organization a consistent foundation for deploying workloads. It defines your subscription structure, network topology, identity architecture, security baselines, and cost management policies before a single application is migrated. Think of it as building codes for your cloud environment. Without codes, every contractor does things differently and you end up with a structure nobody can safely extend. With them, every team follows the same rules, and new workloads slot in without creating compliance gaps. Microsoft's Azure Cloud Adoption Framework defines two landing zone archetypes: the platform landing zone and application landing zones. For most mid-sized companies, implementing both is what separates a successful cloud migration from a disorganized one. Let's talk about next up, why mid-sized companies choose Azure Landing Zone implementation. Mid-sized companies face a specific challenge: they're too large to be informal about cloud governance, but too resource-constrained to build the same infrastructure a Fortune 500 company would. Azure Landing Zone implementation fills that gap by giving a 200-person company the same governance guardrails a 10,000-person enterprise has, at a fraction of the cost. The most common pattern we see: a company migrates 3 or 4 workloads without a landing zone, realizes subscriptions are unmanageable, and then has to retrofit governance onto live production systems. Retrofitting is significantly harder and riskier than building it right the first time. This is also why 67% of digital transformations miss deadlines becomes relevant. The technology is rarely the problem. The absence of a governance framework is. Mid-size companies that skip the landing zone design phase consistently hit the same walls: cost surprises, security incidents, and deployment bottlenecks that slow every team down. Let's talk about next up, the 5 phases of Azure Landing Zone implementation. The 5 phases of Azure Landing Zone implementation are: assess, plan, migrate, govern, and optimize. Each phase has distinct outputs and decision gates. Skipping or compressing any phase creates problems in the one that follows. Discovery maps every workload, its dependencies, its data flows, and its owner. Tools like Azure Migrate and third-party assessment platforms scan your on-premise environment and generate dependency maps. This phase ends with a prioritized application portfolio: which workloads move first, which move later, and which don't move at all. For a typical mid-size company, Azure Cloud Migration services at this phase cost $15,000 to $40,000, depending on environment size and complexity. That's the assessment phase only. For a realistic view of total migration investment, see our guide on how much Azure Cloud Migration actually costs. Next up, let's talk about how Azure Consulting Services build your cloud foundation right. Azure Consulting Services cover the full spectrum of landing zone work: assessment, architecture design, implementation, and post-migration optimization. Most mid-size companies don't have staff who have done this before, and the learning curve is steep enough that getting it wrong costs more than hiring expert help. A Microsoft Azure consulting company doesn't just configure resources. It brings a methodology, a repeatable process for assessing environments, designing landing zones, managing migrations, and handing over a governed foundation your team can maintain. Q Services is a Microsoft certified solutions partner specializing in Azure, which means our team has passed technical assessments and maintains active certifications across the platform. Our guide on how to evaluate a Microsoft Azure consulting partner covers partner selection in detail. The short version: ask about their methodology, not just their technology stack. Any partner can list Azure services. Fewer have a documented process for governance, change management, and knowledge transfer. Let's talk about now how Azure Security Assessment protects your cloud environment. Security in an Azure Landing Zone implementation is not a layer you add after the fact. It's built into the foundation during design. An Azure Security Assessment evaluates your identity configuration, network exposure, data classification, and compliance posture before and after migration. Getting this right during design prevents the much more expensive work of remediating security gaps in a live environment. Azure Active Directory is the identity backbone of every landing zone. Properly configured, it enforces multi-factor authentication, conditional access policies, and privileged identity management for just-in-time administrative access. Poorly configured, it's the most common entry point for security breaches. The key decisions: how you synchronize on-premise Active Directory to Entra ID, how you structure RBAC roles, and how you govern external identities like contractors and partners. These decisions are much easier to get right during landing zone design than to fix after workloads are in production. For healthcare companies, this security baseline maps directly to HIPAA requirements. Our HIPAA-compliant cloud architecture checklist for Azure covers the specific controls that landing zones need to enforce for covered entities. Next up, let's talk about how to migrate on-premise to Azure without business disruption. The question most CTOs actually want answered: how do you migrate on-premise to Azure without taking down critical systems? The answer is phased migration with parallel run periods and clearly defined rollback criteria for each wave. There are 4 primary cloud migration approaches: rehost, replatform, refactor, and retire. Proper Azure cloud migration services start by classifying every workload into one of these categories, then sequencing migration waves accordingly. The classification drives your timeline. Rehost workloads can often move in days. Refactor projects can take months per application. Most mid-size company migrations run 3 to 9 months end-to-end for 50 to 150 workloads, with the landing zone build taking the first 4 to 6 weeks. Human-in-the-loop governance ensures human approval at every deployment stage, which is why Q Services builds explicit approval gates into every migration wave. See what is human-in-the-loop governance for more detail on why this matters operationally. Next up, moving on to Azure Cost Optimization, managing cloud spend after go-live. Azure Cost Optimization consulting is, in our experience, the most underinvested part of any migration plan. Companies spend months planning the technical migration and 2 weeks thinking about cost governance. Then the first Azure bill arrives and the reality gap becomes obvious. The most common overspend patterns. Most companies overspend by 25 to 35% in their first 3 months on Azure. Getting ahead of this requires budget alerts, tagging governance, and monthly cost reviews built into the landing zone from day one. Now, conclusion. Azure Landing Zone implementation is not a technical formality. It's the difference between a cloud environment your team controls and one that controls your team. Mid-size companies benefit most from getting this right the first time. The governance structures, security baselines, and cost controls built into a well-designed landing zone pay dividends for years. Don't start migrating workloads until your landing zone is built. Every company that has skipped this step has paid to rebuild later, usually 12 to 18 months, and when technical debt becomes impossible to ignore. Start with an Azure infrastructure assessment, engage a qualified Azure migration partner, and treat the landing zone as your cloud foundation rather than a prerequisite you can defer. Q Services provides Azure consulting services as a Microsoft certified solutions partner, with 500 plus completed Microsoft platform projects since 2014. If you're planning an Azure landing zone implementation and want a structured assessment before committing to a design, contact our team for a complimentary 30-minute architecture review.